Our next presenter is Professor Simon Eckermann, presenting on medicinal cannabis as a solution to the ageing and palliative care crisis. Simon Eckermann is a Senior Professor of Health Economics at the Australian Health Services Research Institute and University of Wollongong. His research interests, alongside optimising medical cannabis policies, include robust methods for cost effectiveness, evidence synthesis and translation, multiple strategy and efficiency comparisons, allowing for quality care consistent with maximising net benefit, multiplier methods in health promotion settings, multiple domain comparisons in palliative care settings, and value of information methods. Collectively, the principles and research methods he has developed enable optimally informing joint research, reimbursement, implementation and pricing decisions. His related policy, original methodological and applied research are published in the highest impact international health economics, social science, medical decision making and policy journals, and recently collated in the Springer published Health Economics and Theory to Practice, From Theory to Practice. So please welcome Professor Simon Eckermann.
Today's talk, I'm going to focus on some of those methods, but most importantly, I'm going to focus on the social context in which medicinal cannabis can potentially make its impact, and particularly the opportunity provided by the baby boomer ageing process. And you'll see initially in my talk how that leads to a big challenge, and indeed a challenge where we need to be reforming parts of the age and healthcare system. And then I really want to focus after that on the role that medicinal cannabis can play within that. And most importantly, how we should be optimising the use of medicinal cannabis in terms of the policies to get the best net benefit, maximise the net benefit of medicinal cannabis and maximise that role in terms of successful ageing. So what is successful ageing? Alexander Kalash, who's the sort of world guru on ageing, who worked for many years with the World Health Organization, but now leads and is the president of the International Longevity Centre in Brazil and globally, highlights that baby boomers, the generation born between 1946 and 1964, who redefined the notion of adolescence in the 1960s, will want and increasingly demand what he terms a gerontolescence, a lovely term for the notion of successful ageing where you're physically, mentally and socially active. What he also really points to is the need to have community-based approaches to do that, and indeed, in terms of palliative care, have processes of successful death as well as successful ageing. What he really highlights as a culture is that we fail in that objective currently because we tend to put all our stock in that last pillar of what he sees as the 4 pillars required for successful ageing. So he talks about health capital, education capital, and most importantly, social capital, community, friends, family, etc. And then finally, financial capital and or resilience. And unfortunately, in our culture, we tend to put all our stock in that last one. And in reality, we need to be, if we're going to be successfully ageing, and particularly with the baby boomers, remaining physically, mentally, socially active, and indeed having fun, which is the notion of gerontolescence, it's your adolescence and old age, we'll need to be investing in all those other forms of capital. Oh, that's going backwards. So in Australia, if we look at the ABS website where they have the projections of age population, the ageing of the population, and indeed the projections of the whole population, which I might get the people at the back there to click on that for me. I think they were going to click on that. What we have currently is about 14% of the population. There we go. So you've got the ABS population there currently. And I like to refer to the baby boomer population, which is the section in the middle there from currently ages 53 to 71, as the love handles of the age-sex profile. So you can see both males and females, they're a very large cohort within that population. Now that's 2016, and if we go forward, if you go forward to 2045 with the arrow at the bottom, you'll see what's going to happen by 2045. We're going to triple the number of people over the age of 85, and more generally, those who are currently turning 65 are going to live for more than 20 years, and as a result, we're going to get 3 times as many people over 85, 3 times as many people with dementia, and eventually you'll also see much higher rates of people dying. In other words, palliative services required. I'll go back to the normal slide now. So we've got a situation where we're going to face the challenge of successfully ageing from really now until 2045. Indeed, it was really from 2011 when the first of them turned 65. Now, in terms of what the impact of that is, this doesn't seem to be working anymore. So historically, we haven't really experienced the effects of ageing in terms of health expenditure. And that's because while the population has aged, we've had huge reductions in mortality rates or increases in life expectancy. And the numbers there are quite startling. Between 1970 and 2002, in all male and female populations between the age of 44 and 77, the mortality rate's more than halved. And that's been protective of our health expenditure because a lot of the costs associated, particularly in old age, but with health costs generally, are associated with proximity to death. And the ageing costs that we talk about, a very large proportion of them are associated with proximity to death. So the fact we've had reduction in mortality rates means you've got less people dying, less costs associated with people dying. When the Productivity Commission in 2006 did some analysis, they showed that far from ageing having been a major contributor to increase in health expenditure, actually only about 0.18% of health expenditure growth is explained by ageing when you allow for this proximity to death or decline in age-specific mortality rates, decreasing the current mortality and postponing costs to older age. Importantly, what that means is only about a 20th of the growth in health expenditure up until now has been explained by ageing. And it's because you've had this protective effect of increasing life expectancy. However, what's going to happen in the future? Essentially, that's because mortality's been delayed, but it's not going to be delayed forever. So from 2015 to 2045, the absolute rate of mortality will increase by 50%. And that's basically because the baby boomers are dying. The over 85 age groups have not had reductions in mortality rates, and they will die when they get into their 80s, 90s, etc. That in turn leads to an increase in health expenditure from 8 to 12% of GDP by 2045, and half of that as being attributable to ageing. Importantly, when you're looking at how do we actually successfully age, how do we overcome this challenge, all that's modelled on and predicated on the basis that you have continual high costs associated with death and that you've got continual new technology costs. In other words, the type of things which have been occurring in the last 30 and 40 years. So if you want to successfully age, then we need to be addressing how to have lower costs of death, lower costs of palliative care processes, and lower costs associated with new technology. In general, the new technology issue is we need to be better using existing technologies. Now, medicinal cannabis happens to be quite an old technology. It's been around for more than 5,000 years. So we know that we can indeed produce medicinal cannabis, and I'm going to show you in this talk at a very low cost indeed, but actually be very effective. It also has some properties which allow you to better address palliative patient needs. So on this slide, I'm showing you that palliative patient preferences and various studies which have been undertaken with PACS, the same group that Mira and I have worked with for many years, by Nikki McCaffrey and various other authors from PACS, have shown that people in palliative settings, their primary preferences are for finalising affairs, which they normally divide into personal affairs and financial affairs. And that's really about not leaving a mess for their kids. It's not about the finances per se. Being where they want to be, which is their community of choice, and often at home, not always at home. And being with the people they want to be with without distressing them. So in general, what we have currently in our system are some very expensive medicalised therapies, which have very high levels of side effects and interfere with the ability of patients to finalise their affairs in the setting they want to be. They drag them off to hospital settings and for things like radiotherapy, chemotherapy, and indeed many forms of sequelae associated with opioid use, etc. So rather than supporting palliative care preferences, our current medical model very much reorders the palliative care preferences as though they were survival number one, quality of life number two, and then a grab bag of everything else. We know palliative preferences are actually for finalising affairs, reducing distress and burdens to their carers and family, and being where they want to be in the community of choice. Then they talk about their quality of life, then they talk about survival. So exactly reversed. So we have a huge opportunity with medicinal cannabis to address some of these things. Now this talk really is mainly comes from the chapter 12 of the Health Economics from Theory to Practice book, where I directly address the US National Academy of Sciences call to have, or move beyond what we've got in the first part of this slide, which is the evidence about the effects, to public health and health economics research to inform the debates that I'm talking about here. So the evidence from the National Academy of Sciences is that we've got conclusive and substantive evidence for medicinal cannabis in the treatment of chronic pain in adults, which is the most important one because that's 90% of use internationally, and certainly in the US, has some form of chronic pain, and 70% is the primary symptom for using medicinal cannabis. The second one there, antiemetics for chemotherapy-induced nausea, so very much in cancer therapies. We're not just getting pain relief, we're also getting nausea relief. And then the third one there, multiple sclerosis spasticity symptoms. There's been a couple of other reviews done, and some people reminded me last night that there's various other reviews also showing that actually we've got fairly high level evidence in a couple of other areas, and particularly in some things around epilepsy, etc. There's moderate evidence of sleep disturbance, fibromyalgia, and chronic pain with MS, and emerging evidence in increasing appetite and decreasing weight loss, where of course Mira's work is being going to help inform those emerging forms of evidence, and addressing things like Tourette's syndrome, anxiety, PTSD, as we saw in the last session, dementia, and eye pressure and glaucoma. The key thing is, of course, that medicinal cannabis can treat multiple things at the same time with the endocannabinoid system. However, to get an analysis which really informs the maximisation of net benefit, which is what we want in terms of public health and health economics policy, we need to synthesise that evidence and look at the resource use policy implications and how this can be used as part of current systems and certainly as part of current system reform. And that's the call which was made by the US National Academy of Sciences and which really the rest of this talk will address, and Chapter 12 of the Health Economics from Theory to Practice also addresses. So since the 1960s, since the baby boomers have been around, we've, in terms of the science of medicinal cannabis, discovered the potential of the endocannabinoid system and CB2 and CB1 and CB2 receptors, and shown the advantages of medicinal cannabis in, and particularly varieties rich in CBDs, THC, terpenes, flavonoids, etc., that bind with these receptors in various ways in treating a range of chronic disease and palliative care populations, which you've seen from the National Academy of Sciences, but there's also many other reviews out there. The key thing in terms of optimising this use in policy is getting the palette of various medicinal cannabis varieties and provisions customised for the individual patient needs, and particularly the pain needs in the populations who are compassionate access populations. We also need to allow, obviously, for the THC tolerance, and Critically, in terms of gerontolescence, this evidence is being gathered just at the time it's needed, when we're going to face these challenges in terms of the health system costs, but also the need to actually have appropriate therapies, low-cost therapies out there for successful ageing. In doing that, the key thing really, and the key evidence emerging, is around the entourage effects of the terpenes, CBDs, THC, and indeed many other constituent elements of the plant. So scientific research highlights that entourage effects between terpenes, cannabinoids, and potentially other minor cannabinoids, and indeed flavonoids, etc., magnify therapeutic effects and dose response curves and minimise side effects. And you've seen many of those things over the last couple of days with various presentations. Importantly, and what I'm going to focus on, because I'm going to try and focus on pain, which is the primary symptom which medicinal cannabis is used for, is the results from a trial which illustrate this quite beautifully, and that trial is Johnson et al. 2010. So this was a 177-patient, double-blinded, 3-arm, randomised placebo-controlled trial of oral therapies. And importantly, those 3 arms were a terpene-rich 1-to-1 CBD to THC, a THC alone arm, and a opioid alone arm. And the evidence from that trial, when you look at it, is very compelling. So in terms of significant pain relief, and this was in chronic pain and cancer populations, the proportion of patients with a terpene-rich THC to CBD 1-to-1 extract had 43% versus 21% for the opioid arm, and highly statistically significant. And that was for a 30% improvement, so a clinically significant. So we've got a statistically significant result for a clinically significant improvement in pain relief compared with the opioids. And importantly, it also illustrates the entourage effect, because relative to THC alone, we've got almost double as well, 43% versus 23%. So what it's really pointing to is the very large benefits indeed that medicinal cannabis promises in pain populations over our current therapies, opioid therapies. I've also put in there a last point around ketamine, because we did a large study with PACS on ketamine, and it was a definitive trial, an RCT, which conclusively showed that ketamine had no effect on pain relief relative to placebo, while also not reducing opioids or rescue medication use and facing significant side effects. So apart from the opioids themselves, things like ketamine also have been shown to be non-effective in pain populations. So there's a huge need, a crying need for pain populations to have an appropriate therapy, and ideally something, in the case of palliative populations, which also meets their palliative care needs. Their needs to finalise affairs, stay at home, or stay in their place of choice for the process and indeed the place of death. That's going backwards. All right, so all this comes down to how can health economics help? And in many ways, for those who aren't health economists, I often get asked, what do health economics do? And it's really about evidence synthesis. We synthesize the clinical evidence, the epidemiological evidence, the resource use, and the cost evidence. But what we also do is we inform joint decisions of research, reimbursement, and regulation. And in the case of what we're looking at here, that includes related systems to health, so aged care systems as well as health systems. We also deal with political economy issues, and I should say that in medicinal cannabis, in all these things I'm talking about, it's a classic example. We need to look at research, reimbursement, and regulation together, and we need to look at the political economy issues surrounding it. What the community preferences are, which should be informing the net benefit maximisation processes, versus the many vested interests out there. And we know there's pharmaceutical interests, there's interests of all sorts of manufacturers, and of course there's interests which have been around for many years for prohibition, etc. So health economics allows for the context, in this case the baby boomer ageing context, and how we can optimise the net benefit of therapies such as medicinal cannabis within that context. So classically, this is the way we combine the evidence. And the key thing here is it's not all about the trial evidence. The trial evidence are these, up on the right-hand side there, the individual RCTs or systematic review of evidence and indirect comparisons. That only just gives you the relative treatment effect. We need to modify that by the population risk factors in your jurisdiction of interest, wherever you're making it. In the case of Australia, that's going to be the Australian population. In the case of the UK, it's the UK population, etc. You modify your baseline risk by that relative treatment effect you've got to get the absolute benefits and harms. And that's also what GPs should be doing. They're meant to be doing risk-benefit assessment, etc. So what you're really representing here is the decision process for public policy in terms of estimating what the potential net clinical benefit is, but it's also the process that clinicians go through. The bottom line there in that bottom sphere then combines that with the evidence of resource use and cost to get to net benefit. So all net benefit is the net clinical benefit, also allowing for the resource use and cost. So it's the value of the effects less their cost is what net benefit represents. That's the kind of basic 101 in health economics and how we synthesize the evidence and indeed what we need to do to actually get to a net benefit objective, which I think is key in this space because we have at the moment many other political objectives and many other agendas and many other vested interests being represented, but not the net benefit to the community, which is the key. And you need to hammer them over and over again because you can show with health economics how suboptimal it is currently. We can show what the optimum is, what we have currently, and how suboptimal we are. Now, in doing that, we also need to allow for the joint research, reimbursement, and regulatory decisions. And this is a diagram taken from my book, which gives you the full decision cycle, where you're looking at, do we have problems in terms of the amount of evidence we have? When we do get evidence, do we have enough evidence? Do we need to get further evidence? How do we optimise that evidence? And the value information methods there allow you to do that locally, but more importantly, also globally. And so there's many, many advantages you get from doing global research, collaborating with researchers, and having indeed forums like this where you bring that all together. The health economist is trying to bring all that evidence together to say what are the net benefit optimising strategies, and in the case of the medicinal cannabis, what's the way in treating each patient that's optimal? Because as David Bass has pointed to in the very first session we had on the first day, it's about precision medicine. To optimise, we need precision medicine. But all these things give you the way to make decisions jointly around research, reimbursement and regulation, and in the book, all the methods around that are described in great detail. So to give you a flavour and indeed what you will need in medicinal cannabis to really show the full potential and the full maximising of net benefit of medicinal cannabis, you need to be looking at principles, and there's basically coverage and comparability principles that you need to satisfy to optimise joint research, reimbursement and regulatory decisions. Within that, there's some very key methods that you need to know about, and they're multiple strategy provider or domain comparisons, because in reality, we've got many, many potential strategies out there, many, many different terpene profiles, etc., and we need to have methods to look at all of them simultaneously and narrow down very quickly what are the potentially optimal ones for my patient population. And then indeed, to modify that at a policy level, research level, but indeed clinician level as well, in terms of what you see the response in your patient, and then update that evidence to say we need to consider these extra things that we'd observed, and therefore we might modify our therapy, or if it's successful, keep it going. The other thing you're going to need, of course, is to look at optimal joint research and reimbursement design. And there's a whole series of value information methods out there which a colleague of mine, Andy Willen, and I have devised many of them internationally, and various other colleagues as well, such as John Carnan in Australia. And they allow you to optimise the value of your research relative to the cost of your research. And when we're talking about the value, we're talking about the value to policymakers. And that's going to be key also to drive the policy making, maximising net benefit in medicinal cannabis. You need to have the research designed to do that. Okay? And those methods naturally give you the ability to do that, and indeed meet up with the requirements of bodies like the NHMRC, who have all of them as their first statement, we need to be getting value for our research dollar. And you can show it with those methods and have much greater success in getting your designs up and get funding. That's the key thing. But more importantly, when you get funding, actually make a difference in practice, because your research is designed to make a difference in practice. We also need unbiased evidence translation, synthesis and extrapolation, and there's a whole series of methods in the book which deal with that, and that's point 4 there. Finally, and this is the most important point in terms of the political economy, we need research on better use of existing programs and technologies, best expansion and contraction of current options, and appropriate pricing in terms of integrating new technology. So new technology, when we're saying should we invest in new technology, what should we be comparing it against? The best extension of existing technology. Okay? And currently we have huge biases in the system which encourage new technology and don't encourage existing technology, which is one of the things medicinal cannabis is facing, because it's a very old technology indeed. But we need to be pressing them to say, actually, this is a very low-cost technology which has huge benefit. So in terms of the net clinical benefit of cannabis, or particularly medicinal cannabis, in the MJA in 2013, Mather noted that the benefits of cannabinoid pharmacotherapy can be substantial, the risks are generally modest, and must be weighed against those of not treating the symptoms or of alternative treatments. Well, apart from the word pharmacotherapy there, I'd be very happy with that statement. In reality, we know that we can use it in plant forms, in flower forms, etc. But importantly, what it's pointing to is the huge potential medicinal cannabis has, as we've discussed over the last 3 days. We know that the potential side effects are much less than the alternative therapies, and particularly in the case I'm looking at in pain management, the opioid therapies, which have much more severe side effects than the typical tiredness, dizziness, potential psychological effects from THC and dry mouth. Also much less than things like ketamine. Okay? As we've seen, ketamine shouldn't be used given the definitive study which has been done to show its lack of effect and indeed problems with side effects. In terms of optimising, we really need to get terpenes, CBD and THC-rich varieties grown for precision medicine use and provided to individual patient needs. And that's in terms of symptom control, mode of administration, dosing and titration, and meeting daily functioning needs. And typically, and I update this slide and the bottom point every time I hear different talks, over time, because I'm learning as most people are in this field. And we're really talking here currently typically about CBD-rich Savita varieties in the daytime and THC-rich indica at night, so that you don't interfere with daily activities and actually get the benefits of sleeping and pain relief at night, etc. The evidence we've already pretty much looked at there for, in terms of pain relief, how that plays out in terms of the main trial which I refer to, the Johnson trial. We also know from Galilee's study about terpene importance in entourage effect and the dosing. That's very important to have those terpenes. And how should they be provided? Well, they should be provided as they are being provided in places like Israel, with the use of precision medicine and good agricultural practice. And physicians customising to individual patient tolerance and daily needs. Okay? And we've discussed the typical case there as well. Importantly, even where things are suboptimally done, as they are in the US, we have very good population level evidence to say that the states with medicinal cannabis programs showed by 6 years, and this is typically quoted as just the average result, which was a 24.8% reduction in opioids, but actually what they showed was by 6 years, there was a 33% reduction. And that was increasing over time. So when people quote the 24.8%, that's not really the effect you expect. You expect a much bigger effect over time than that 24.8% reduction. So that was shown by Bakaba in 2014. What Broadfoot and Broadfoot showed last year was that in over 65 populations, the populations we're particularly interested in this talk, the prescription medication use was 12% lower for pain prescriptions and 8 to 13% lower for anxiety, depression, nausea, psychosis, and sleep order prescriptions. These are all the big ticket items. Okay, so we can see from this why we've got nervousness from pharmaceutical industry particularly, because they know that medicinal cannabis therapies, and it's been shown with evidence, will reduce their prescription medications. The key thing is that we've got population evidence of being safer for pain management and the role as an opiate-sparing exit drug. Okay? That's provided by that evidence there as well. So the usual political kind of games which are played, pretending that the medicinal cannabis is going to be some sort of problem and demon, etc., are very much exposed as a myth there. So we know that medicinal cannabis can avoid many of the common side effects of typical alternative, and particularly in my case, opioid therapies with pain management, or in the case of palliative care and cancer care, things like radiotherapy or chemotherapy. And those things prevent them from being able to finalise affairs in their community of choice. What we need to do is optimise precision use of terpenes, CBD and THC-rich varieties and their modes of administration for patient daily needs. And critically, in terms of what this means for the health economics, it all depends on the way these things are cultivated and the way they're grown to get these THC, CBD and terpene-rich varieties. That's going to determine what the net benefit is to society. Okay, so we're adding in the bit from net clinical benefit to extend to net benefit. And in that space, there's a very key set of evidence out there about indoor versus outdoor costs and opportunity cost. So to optimise therapy benefits, compassionate access providers need to access to appropriate terpene, CBD and THC-rich strains. And we know that the best terpenes in particular, and indeed the highest quality terpenes, are grown outdoors, or more generally in sunlight, air and natural soil conditions. The halfway house, of course, between indoor and outdoor is the greenhouse, and we can certainly address or try to address in the greenhouse many of the things that you can't address indoors to try and get better air and sunlight and soil conditions. However, we know the best conditions are the natural conditions, where you can grow them, so where you have the climate. And we have that in Australia. And we have it in abundance, but we also have the subclimates that you need to grow all the different types of varieties. So we know that higher yielding terpene-rich strains grow better with natural sunlight, air and space to reach the natural height, but also to get the quality of terpenes that we'd like to express, and particularly from the F1 females that we want to have to get the best terpenes. The other thing we really need to look at is the cost, of course, and the best estimates of factor costs of outdoor cultivation and drying to good agricultural practice, and indeed what's increasingly being shown also good manufacturing practice, are between 10 and 20 cents per gram of cannabis. Okay, and that was from 2010. There may be some slight inflation from there, from Calkins. But importantly, the relativity of that cost to costs of in a greenhouse, it's about 40% of the cost in a greenhouse, which is 2.5 times more, at 25 to 50 cents per gram. And hydroponic indoor costs are 10 times the amount of growing it outdoors, $1 to $2.50. So it's not just that we're getting the best terpene profiles, etc. We're also getting about 1/10 the cost. So the cost of indoor cultivation is approximately 10-fold outdoor production and 4-fold that in greenhouses. And for distributed manufacturing costs, so that's just the basic cost, this translates to about $10 versus $2.50 versus $1 per gram. Indoor growing also faces many other issues around plant disease, mould, plant quality and high energy use in attempting to replicate growing conditions with natural air and sunlight. So there's some lovely quotes out there from various sources, and this is my favourite one. In an unvirtuous cycle, the intense heat from the rights requires air conditioning and fans to keep growing rooms at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, a dehumidifier to prevent mould, and a carbon dioxide injection system. Incredibly intense energy use and use of high technology. And what are they trying to do? Recreate sunlight and air and soil conditions. The bottom line here is that a pound grown indoors has energy consumption equivalent to driving across America 7 times. Okay? Huge energy consumption. It now, in America, with 1 million users in 2015, was more than 1% of national energy consumption. And the carbon dioxide emissions from indoor growing were the equivalent of 3 million cars. Okay, so I suggest Australia should be learning from the experience in America and not growing it indoors. Because in reality, it's not just about the quality, it's about the cost and the environmental impact that this has. If we looked at a whole program cost, and at the moment we can estimate from the US prevalence that there'd be about 200,000 for pain management alone in Australia. And we know that 90% of symptoms treated in the US are for pain and 70% is the primary symptom. Well, at $1 per day or $1 per gram, assuming people use 1 gram per day, you would get $1 per day per person versus $11 with alternative forms of pain management or indoor growing. So you get basically a factor price saving at 1 gram per day of Australian $10 a day, or $730 million per year domestically. So 200,000 people, $365 is what they end up paying, rather than just over $4,000. You save $3,650 per person and $730 million per year domestically. That's just the direct cost saving. In a slide or two, I'll show you some of the downstream cost savings, and they are even greater. We also, of course, if we grow the highest quality things outdoors and at that low cost, have huge export potential from both quality and cost comparative advantages. Oh, I'm going backwards again. So in Australia, where we have the environment to grow these things outdoors and indeed do it in microclimates to optimise for each variety, it optimises the range and quality of cannabis varieties required to optimise net clinical benefit with precision medicine, and particularly in the compassionate access and palliative populations. It minimises the cultivation costs and environmental impacts, and it supports continuing research for precision medicine in optimising patient preferences and palliative preferences, daily needs and tolerance of compassionate access populations. So the bottom line is that medicinal cannabis for chronic pain and palliative care in Australia, outdoor cultivation of terpene, CBD and THC-rich medicines with good agricultural practice and precision medicine provision enables physicians to maximise the individual net clinical benefit for improved pain management, reduced side effects, whether the opioids and other pain therapies such as ketamine. And of course, doing this appropriate for risk-benefit assessment, as we've seen extensively in the lovely course that David Caldercutt ran on day one. And in terms of mode of administration and titration of dose, where we already have very many examples such as gabapentin to rely on for the types of titration we can use. For the palliative population, it facilitates all those extra dimensions that palliative populations have in terms of finalising affairs in the community of choice and reducing family and carer distress. It also supports robust research, optimising varieties by individual patient symptom needs and all the other factors that we're interested in risk-benefit assessment, and save $10 per day in direct pain management. But what I've got on the bottom there is also the downstream costs you save. So the extra 22% of the population in the case of palliative patients or cancer patients who have better pain control, we don't expect to go into a hospital setting. And there's evidence there that you save about $13,000 from them not going into a hospital setting for that type of pain management. And across the population, that's actually several $billion in terms of chronic pain. And finally, it ensures quality-controlled Australian medicinal supply while creating scope for future export market and minimising energy use. And in conclusion, coming back to our successful baby boomer ageing, successful baby boomer ageing pioneers for all, but affordable reform needs to be addressed, and particularly end-of-life challenges and better use of existing technologies and integrating new technologies, given their opportunity costs at their price. In these respects, in all these respects, optimal use of medicinal cannabis is key in addressing palliative care options and the preferences of patients, better research, and the actual net benefit expected in practice. The big point at the bottom is a major challenge, as ever, is getting community voices heard. In other words, the net benefit maximising heard in the process, and having health systems serve those community preferences, not the vested interests, not the role. And there's a role here very much for things like citizens' juries in complex decision-makings, which Gavin Mooney, in his lovely book, The Health of Nations Towards a New Political Economy, points to. Thank you.